Newsload London presents.
Hello, Mark.
Hi, Carrie-Anne. How you doing?
What is your knowledge of the comedic talent that you've seen around the world?
You know, the people in Toronto and Los Angeles and New York generally were not born there. They're generally from somewhere else. So if you're the funniest guy, the funniest girl in London, Ontario, chances are you cut your teeth on whatever is local, and then you move on. You move to Toronto after that, and then after Toronto, you probably move to Los Angeles if you want to go for the big time. I always get this arc. Somebody says to me, listen, I want to do as many places as you possibly can send me.
Put me everywhere.
Put me everywhere. And then, 3 years later, they come to me and say, look, I just got married, so I just want to perform places where I can go and be back in my home that night.
Yeah.
And then 3 years later after that, they come to me and say,
get me out of here!
I just had a kid, so put me anywhere you want. Put me anywhere you can send me. Anywhere you can send me is good. So that's sort of the arc. This business is really unfair. And it's unfair because there's no middle class. You're either struggling or you're making too much money. 1% of the practitioners of comedy make 99% of the income.
Yep.
That's a very unhealthy business. You would never say that about lawyers. You would never say that about doctors. You would never say that about teachers. The income gap just isn't great. But in comedy, the income gap is enormous.
Does censorship frustrate you?
Well, it doesn't frustrate me because I don't pay any attention to it, and I never have. When I started Yuck Yucks, I had two goals. A bunch of other goals that were personal, but I had two comedy goals. One was to keep the Canadian comedy business Canadian and hire Canadians first, which I've done. And I'm proud to say I have put millions, probably $30 million in the hands of Canadian comedians over the years. But the second one was that I would have a completely uncensored business, that people would not be able to censor me in any kind of a way. The audience censors. How does the audience censor? The audience censors by not laughing. If the audience
or booing.
Or booing. They rarely boo, but they don't laugh. And if they don't laugh, then the comic doesn't get laughs. And what am I in the business of? Providing laughter. There isn't any material where people are saying, kill this guy or shoot that person. That never happens. The comics are fairly peaceful people, but they hate hypocrisy, and they hate hypocrisy when it comes to sex or politics or things like that.
I have a quote, laughter is how we see freedom. How do you?
Well, laughter is certainly involved in, yes, there's a freedom to laughter. Certainly after you laugh, you feel free, don't you? You feel good. You feel like there's a weight off your shoulders in some ways, right?
Almost like a tickle massage.
It's a therapy. And I have told people, young comics at Humber College, for instance, that ultimately they're in the therapy business. And their job is to make people's burden lighter, to lighten their burden. So, yes, there's an element of freedom involved in comedy. And, when I started this, I never had a political agenda, and I still don't. But I did have a psychological agenda. And my psychological agenda was to make people feel that they have the mental freedom to be able to say and think whatever they want to say and think. Because everywhere you go, people judge you. Everywhere you go, you fight public opinion. You fight tradition. And isn't it great that there's a place and there's a kind of thing you can do called comedy that has no respect for public opinion? They say we live in a free country, but what does that really mean? It may mean that there are no laws against certain things, but there are all kinds of public relations issues and the way that people want you to think and want you to act. You can't really be free in life. You can't tell your boss what you really think of him. You can't really tell your wife what you really think of her.
You can, but you might start a fight.
Yeah, and you don't want to start a fight. But in comedy, it's like free parking in the Monopoly board. You can kind of do and say whatever you want as long as people understand that that's the game.
Fear inspires division, but funny inspires unity.
In the beginning, certainly. Not so much now, but in the beginning, I was very proud of the fact that you would look at the Yuck Yucks audience and it was so diverse. And I mean, I'm not talking about racial diversity necessarily, but it was diverse age was everything from 18 to 60. It was everything from really rich people. You'd see them walking in, the women with their furs, and poets with no money at all, because it was really cheap to get in. It was $3 or something. And it made me feel really great that a comic could get on stage and bring all these very disparate people together through laughter. Now it's a bit different because there's a demographic for everything. There's a friend of mine who's a comic, and he's a woke comic. And everything about his act is woke. And he sees his act not just as making people laugh, but as propaganda for his position. And okay, that's fine. So he gets a big festival. And he goes on stage at the festival, and he's got 2,000 people in front of him. Biggest audience he's ever played. And he goes into his woke comedy. And people are cheering, and people are agreeing, and people are right with him. And he walks off to, huge applause. And he thinks, wow, I've not only made them laugh, I've influenced them. Then the next comic gets on. And the next comic basically is against everything the first guy says. And they're cheering him, and they're loving him, and they're laughing at him, and they give him a big ovation when he leaves. Because they forgot the first guy. As long as the comic is on stage, you're with him. If he's a good comic, you're agreeing with whatever he says. And then as soon as he's gone, it's off to the new shiny object. I would love to think that comedy was that important, that it actually influenced political behavior. It doesn't really. I don't think it really does, not by much.
Social media is changing our society. What do you feel that it's doing for comedy?
It's changed everything in every way possible. Russell Peters was funny before he was famous. Russell Peters was funny, unfortunately, for only hundreds of people, or maybe low thousands of people. But then he was one of the first people to realize how to exploit his act on YouTube, and then hundreds of thousands, millions of people. It went, as they call it, viral. Saw it and loved it, fell in love with him, and all of a sudden, his visibility went from minor to major.
This is the Newsload.